Hey guys, Tyler up here, and today I'm going to be explaining everything you need to know about troop transports in Company of Heroes 2. There are two categories of troop transport: closed top, which include the 251 and the Opal Blitz. When you load a unit into these closed top troop transports, you cannot see them from the outside. And then open top troop transports that are the rest of these, which, surprise surprise, have an open top, so when a unit is loaded into them, you can see it from the outside. The advantage to open top troop transports is that the unit inside can shoot at enemies, so this can be quite a powerful combination during the early phases of the game. The most common example is of course the combat engineer with a flamethrower for Soviets inside the M3A1. The exception to this is the universal carrier. Although you can see the unit inside, they are unable to fire out. All of these open top transports have 4 positions for the unit inside to shoot from, except for the M3 available to US forces and the Brits that has 5 firing positions. However, the disadvantage to open tops is that the unit inside can take damage, whether that be from small arms shooting at the units inside, or from AoE damage of explosives targeting the troop transport itself. The amount of damage the unit inside takes from the explosive depends on where the shell lands. If it lands on the front of the troop transport, where there is a relatively long distance between the explosive impact and the unit inside, they will take very little to no damage. But if it lands on the rear, where there is a very short distance to the unit inside, they could take a huge amount of damage. Whereas units in the closed top troop transports do not take any damage. These open top troop transports provide a unique type of cover to the units in the firing positions called garrison half-track, which is quite a lot different to regular garrison cover that ambient buildings provide. It is slightly better against small arms fire, way better against flamethrowers where it reduces the damage by 90% instead of increasing it by 25%, worse against tanks where it only halves the damage done to the units inside instead of quartering it, which means an entire squad inside the universal carrier can die to just one medium tank shot. The garrison half-track cover halves damage from grenades, and that includes anti-tank grenades and Panzerfausts, which can damage the occupants of these open-top troop transports. However, not all of these snares are created equal when it comes to damaging the occupants of open-top troop transports. The OKW and Austria Panzerfaust have quite bad AoE, so if you shoot a Panzerfaust directly into the rear of the M3A1, it barely does any damage to the occupants. But if the Faust connects into the rear corner, it can do about 25 damage to the model that is standing there, still quite a low amount. Whereas for the Conscript anti-tank grenade, Panzer Fusilier anti-tank grenade, and Rifleman anti-tank rifle grenade, they have much better AoE, so when they connect directly on the rear, they do 50 damage to the 2 closest occupants. The British anti-tank grenade, available to AT sections and Royal Engineers, is quite unusual. You can see it scatters off to the right, so it only damages one of the occupants when thrown from directly behind. But if you come to the corner position, now it does 50 damage to all of the occupants, which is actually very strong. So be careful, because the damage from these anti-tank grenades could end up getting your squad wiped. And if possible, try face the front of the troop transport towards the snaring squad to soak up the AoE damage of the anti-tank grenade. And finally, there is the penal sticky satchel that will kill the troop transport and most likely all of the occupants as well. These AoE differences mean that Austria 250 play is generally a lot worse, since the occupants end up taking so much more damage from the allied snares. It also reinforces Panzer Fusiliers as a good counter to the Soviet M3A1, since it is available immediately without any tech truck being down, has longer range than the Volksgrenadier Panzerfaust, and blasts the enemy occupants for a good amount of damage as well. So it could be a good idea to jump the squad out of the troop transport before the snare lands, so the squad inside doesn't take any damage. And this way the full health squad may be able to do enough damage to the snaring squad to force it away and allow the troop transport to limp home to safety. So now let me show you the best way of getting out of a troop transport. The most obvious way is to use the Unload Selected Troops button. When you press this, the squad inside will get out, and what you have selected will switch from the troop transport to the units that were previously inside. The issue with this is that if you use the unload selected troops button while the transport is moving, it will come to a halt and unload the troops, and this loss of momentum could cause the transport's death. Instead, once you have the troop transport selected, hit Tab to select the unit that is inside the troop transport, and then right-click where you want that unit to go. This doesn't slow down the transport at all, and the unit inside goes straight to where you want them, making this technique much more efficient overall. Another helpful tip for these fast drop-offs is to have your troop transport bound to a control group, because during the drop-off, what you have selected will switch from the troop transport to the unit that's getting out, so you will need to quickly reselect the troop transport and then drive it away to safety, which is much easier to do when it is bound to a control group. And if you want to do this drop-off maneuver with the troop transport that has 2 units inside, now the control group allows you to quickly reselect the troop transport and give the get-out order to the second squad. If you look closely, you can see that initially, as the squad is unloading, they don't have access to any of their normal functions. Then, after about half a second, they have access to the attack function, and then after 0.63 of a second, they have access to all of their functions. So if you are trying to do a time-sensitive maneuver, such as jumping out of the troop transport and then firing off an anti-tank grenade, be aware of this delay, because if you try to execute this command while the squad is still unloading, the option simply will not be there. And this also applies to when you are unloading from a building. And this delay appears to scale with the number of models, so for a lower model squad, you'll get access to your options earlier. Another reason that you might want to jump out quickly is that when a troop transport dies that is carrying units, each individual model that is inside has a 50% chance of dying. So if you get unlucky enough, you could potentially lose entire squads. So try to jump out before the troop transport dies whenever possible. Oh my god, I lost everything! And for one of the finer details, what side of the troop transport does your squad get out of? The M3A1 is unique. The squad can get out of the left or the right hand side. For the M5, the squad can only get out of the rear. And for all of the other troop transports, you can only get out of the right hand side. So you might want to face the other side towards the enemy so your squad doesn't get blasted while they are super clumped up as they try to unload from the troop transport. Now let's talk about what you can put inside your troop transport. So far we've seen infantry go into every type of troop transport with no issues. However, snipers cannot get into open top troop transports, though they can get into closed top transports. Team weapons that have a retreat function, such as machine guns and mortars, can get into both types of troop transport, but they cannot get into a single slot troop transport, such as this M3A1. It has to be a double slot troop transport to carry team weapons. And when the team weapon is inside the open top transport, the heavy weapon itself cannot fire, only the crew members. And team weapons that cannot retreat, such as anti-tank guns, are unable to go into either type of troop transport. The exception, of course, being the Raketen, since that can retreat. Another nice function of these double slot troop transports is that when they are out of combat, they can heal the occupants. This is generally a bit too micro-intensive to use as your only form of healing long term, but can work nicely as a stopgap measure or as opportunities arise on the battlefield. For a transport to count as being out of combat for this healing to activate, it has to be neither shot at nor shooting at an enemy for 10 seconds. However, there is a slight trick here. If you put the transport on hold fire and nothing is shooting at it, the units inside can heal while shooting at enemies themselves. These double slot troop transports can reinforce nearby units up to a distance of 20 range. The 250 can also reinforce troops at Vet 1, though to a slightly shorter distance. And at Vet 3 the reinforcement range gets increased to 30, though not for the 250. The exception to this being the Opel Blitz, since it doesn't have any veterancy, it has a reinforcement range of 25. Speaking of veterancy, all of these troop transports benefit from a mechanic called shared veterancy. If you have a squad of infantry within 35 range of the troop transport that is gaining veterancy, the troop transport will also gain veterancy even without doing any damage itself. This is helpful because a lot of these troop transports are quite weak in combat, so without the shared veterancy they would be very hard to vet up. It doesn't steal any experience away from the infantry, it's just free vet, and it only works with your infantry. not your teammates' infantry, not team weapons, nor vehicles. And the transport gets 50% of the veterancy that the nearby squads earn. A lot of these transports have the option to upgrade a weapon, however if you do this the transport will no longer be able to carry units or reinforce them. And the exception is the WC-51, which can still carry units after upgrading its machine gun. Minesweepers can still detect mines from inside open-top troop transports. This is one of the things that allows the bazooka bust to be so successful, since the M3 has 5 slots, 4 for the bazookas, 1 for the sweeper, meaning you can't counter it with mines. However, there is a little known trick that you can actually sweep mines from inside the troop transport. If you drive over the mines, jump your engineer out of the troop transport, then back into it, they will start to sweep the mines from inside of the troop transport. And if you look closely, you can see each engineer is pointing in a different direction, meaning they're each sweeping a different mine. So this is a very fast way of taking down an S-mine field or multiple mines in a small region. And using this trick, you can sweep mines that are 20 range away, so it does give you quite a lot of leeway with your movements. Putting a squad inside an open-top transport and driving around doesn't come without its drawbacks. Since the June 2019 patch, the squad inside will suffer a 60% accuracy penalty while the vehicle is moving. And turning on the spot counts as moving, so will also cause this penalty to kick in. So if possible, try to keep your transport stationary so the squad inside can fire with full accuracy for maximum DPS. One function that can help you achieve this is to use the handbrake mode on your transport. This will cause it to stop in the exact direction that you command it to, so it won't try to rotate to face the enemy so its machine gun fires at them. And this can also leave you in a better position to start chasing them down on retreat. It is especially handy on the M3A1 that has a machine gun on its rear that you might be using to damage the enemy instead of the front machine gun. So you don't want it auto-rotating to face the enemy, losing machine gun firing time. And the machine gun on the rear of the M3A1 actually has slightly more DPS than the one on the front. So the handbrake mode helps you utilize this a lot more effectively. The handbrake mode does work the vast majority of times, but sometimes the transport just decides to rotate itself. Code 2 things. However, it is not all bad news for DPS when it comes to putting squads inside open-top troop transports. Burst weapons such as submachine guns, LMGs and assault rifles tend to have a penalty applied to their burst duration while the squad is moving, and this is one of the major factors that contribute to the loss of DPS when firing on the move. However, if we test this in game with the shock troop model out in the open stationary, and one inside an open-top troop transport that is moving, you can see that the burst length and cooldown for the two squads is roughly the same. So the firing on the move penalties that the squad would usually experience do not apply to a moving troop transport. They will only get that 60% accuracy nerf that I mentioned earlier. And for reference, here's what the shock troop looks like when firing on the move. You can see the short burst length and the short cooldown between bursts. A technique that has been gaining popularity in the high levels of play as of late is slowing down infantry retreats by blocking them with your vehicle. To achieve this, you need to get in front of the leading model of the retreating squad. If you try to block the other models, they will just phase through your vehicle and then hit stop or weave around in front of that leading model, forcing them to run around your vehicle. And this can significantly slow them down while they are retreating. Now you can do this trick with any type of vehicle, but it is very strong in these open-top transports since they are typically fast, which makes it easier to execute, and the squad inside the transport can be shooting the entire time, whereas some other vehicles might have their machine gun or turret facing the wrong direction when trying to execute this. If you are looking for a lower effort method of chasing, this is again where the handbrake mode really shines. You can drive in front of the enemy and then hit stop, locking the transport in place, allowing your squad inside to shoot with max accuracy as the squad runs past them again. And once they're in front of you, you can easily restart the chase since you will be facing the correct direction. When it comes to criticals that are applied to the vehicle, blinds such as the Stuart's Shell Shock, the Strug's Heat Shell and Tulip Rockets from the Firefly, these all stop the unit inside from firing while they are active. However, stuns such as Target Weak Point on the Elephant does not stop the squad inside from firing. And for the Ossir Sniper's Incendiary Shot, it can target vehicles, However, if you do it on the front of the troop transport, it will not stun the units inside, just do some light damage to the vehicle. But if you do it on the rear, it will generally pick off a model and stop the unit inside from firing. The rest of this video covers the target priority system, explaining why units inside troop transports shoot and what they do. As you can see, it is quite long and only provides a small amount of value for improving your gameplay. So continue watching if you want that little edge, or if you're looking to nerd out on how the game works. The issue with putting a squad inside an open top transport is that when you right click an enemy, the vehicle will target the enemy, but the squad inside will not. This means that the squad inside the troop transport is very often targeting the wrong unit. Best case scenario, you end up missing out on a squad wipe. Worst case scenario, you end up losing your troop transport and the entire squad inside it if you get unlucky with the death crits. The way that the automatic targeting system works inside the troop transport is the same for the squad when it is out in the open. However, since you can give commands to units that are out in the open, the automatic targeting system doesn't play much of a factor. If you select a unit inside a troop transport, you can see that the only option they have is to unload selected troops. So if you right click an enemy with the squad inside the troop transport, instead of targeting them, they jump out of the vehicle. This means you can't overcome the auto targeting system by giving a separate order to the unit inside the troop transport, because that is not an option. So quite a few of the tests shown in this video will be using a squad out in the open instead of inside a troop transport for ease of demonstration. Digging into the mod tools, we can find the targeting priority system for different weapons, and we're going to start out looking at the penal PTRS. So starting at the top, we have a current target value of 8. This means that whatever the unit is currently shooting at, it wants to continue shooting at that target, and will continue to do so unless the factors that we'll learn about later are strong enough to override this. Next down the list is distance, far having a value of 1 and near having a value of 6. So the PTRS penal is more inclined to shoot at units close to it than further away. As a demonstration of this, here we have two identical Raketen set up and a PTRS penal model. This yellow line here is the midway point between the two Raketens. And when I switch the Raketens to become enemy controlled, whichever Raketen is closer, the PTRS penal starts to shoot at that one. So now for a current target demonstration, switching the Raketen to become enemies at the same time, the penal targets the Raketen on the left since it is a little bit closer to that one. And as I move the penal further and further away from the left Raketen, it continues to target it. And it is not until I get beyond the max range of the PTRS, which is this purple line here, that the penal switches over to the Raketen on the right hand side instead. So when two identical targets are available, simply getting closer to one of them over the other is not enough to override the current target situation, since current target has a value of 8 and the difference between far and near is only 5. So what this means in practice for your squad inside an open top troop transport for identical enemy targets is that you need to get out of range of what the squad is currently shooting at and closer to what you intend the squad to shoot at in order to switch the focus fire across. When shooting at infantry, the good news is that the current target priority is based on the model rather than the whole squad itself. So in this example, if I kill the model that the penal inside the troop transport is shooting at, they switch over to shooting at the closer target since that has a higher priority now that the current target is dead. So against infantry, you might not need to go out of range of the current target to reset what the squad inside is shooting at if the squad inside can kill the model that they were shooting at, thus resetting the current target priority. Getting back into the mod tools, next down the list is over penetration priority penalty. Bit of a tongue twister that one. Basically, if you have more than 100% chance to penetrate the enemy target, a penalty is applied to the next value down the list, which is penetration. I prepared a whole section on the penetration calculation, but unfortunately the numbers that it was returning was not matching up to the behavior that I was seeing in game. So instead I'll just have to provide some more generalized advice for these anti-tank wielding units. They want to shoot at whatever they are closest to 100% chance to penetrate. So now demonstrating this in-game, here we have a PTRS penal against the OKW vehicle lineup. The PTRS penal initially shooting at the King Tiger, then as soon as it gets in range of the Panzer IV, switching over to that, and then as soon as it gets in range of the Lux, switching over to that, and then as it continues down the line, the PTRS continues to shoot at the Lux as long as it's in range. And then doing this in the reverse order, the PTRS initially shooting at the Kubel, then switching over to the flak half-track, then switching over to the Puma, and finally once again settling on the Lux. So you can see the Lux with an armor value of 55 against the PTRS's penetration of between 100 and 70 is the real sweet spot for the PTRS. Doing the same demonstration for the Austria vehicle lineup, now it's the Flak Panzer that's the sweet spot for the PTRS with its frontal armor value of 110. An interesting thing to note here, on the way back, the PTRS switches over from shooting at the 251 to the 222 in spite of them having identical armor values. I believe this happens because the 222 is further away, thus the PTRS is using its far penetration value, which is closer to the 100% penetration target than the now perhaps mid penetration value it would be using against the 251, so it switches over. Now if we do the same test but against their rear armor, you can see the PTRS squad never ends up targeting the Panther, jumping straight from the Tiger to the Panzer IV, which is strange because the Panther and the Panzer IV actually have the same rear armor value, and this should be a much more appealing target than the 140 armor on the back of the Tiger. Continuing down, the PTRS's switch over to shooting at the Flak Panzer, which again I think is a strange result. Admittedly, 55 rear armor against 75 penetration does make the Flak Panzer an appealing target, but now we're probably mid-range against the Panzer IV, so 85 penetration against 90 rear armor, and that should be the higher priority target, so there is some funky behavior when it comes to rear armor. Testing the rear of the OKW lineup, PTRS's switch over from the King Tiger to the Panzer IV as expected, but as soon as they get in range of the Lux, they switch over to shooting at that instead, which is very strange because the Lux with 35 rear armor gives a 200% penetration chance compared to the 94% chance against the Panzer IV, so once again that should be the much higher priority target, especially when you factor in what we learned earlier about current targets having a higher priority and targets that are nearer also having a high priority, so this was really confusing to me. So initially it appears as though rear armor isn't a factor when it comes to these calculations, but in a couple of different experiments I did, that shook my confidence in that theory as well. This issue had me stumped for weeks, so since the in-game performance seems to be different to what the numbers suggest, I have decided to simply show a bunch of these different lineup demonstrations with different weapons, so we can learn it that way instead, since the numbers don't seem to hold up. For the bazooka that has more penetration than the PTRS, the sweet spot against OKW is now the Panzer IV instead of the Lux. However, against Austria, the Flak Panzer is still the favourite target. And for the Piat that has near identical penetration to the bazooka, it behaves in exactly the same way as the bazooka, favouring the Panzer IV against OKW and the Flak Panzer against Austria. For the elite bazookas that paratroopers and rangers get that have more penetration, they prefer to target the Panzer IV over the Flak Panzer. And there is an unusual issue with putting a Piat inside a troop transport. When the projectile scatters long, because it doesn't shoot in a straight line, instead it arcs like throwing a ball, it can actually float over the intended target, and this seems to be amplified by the fact that they are elevated in the back of the half-track. This actually seems to happen quite regularly when they are close to max range, so for that reason putting a Piat inside an open-top troop transport is probably the worst of all. And for the Panzerschreck, which has a penetration of 180 near to 160 far, the sweet spot is the medium tank such as the T-34-76. Now there's probably a handful of you thinking, hey, team weapons have an armor value of 70, so they should be a pretty appealing target. So, how are they handled? Well, the PTRS has a range of 40 and the SVT has a range of 35, so this means that initially when the enemy team weapon comes into range, you will most likely fire off a volley of PTRS shots. And then the PTRSs tend to stay in the firing positions of the open top troop transport even when you come within the 35 range where the SVTs could fire from. However, for bazookas that have 35 range and more penetration, here the rifle models tend to take priority in the firing positions, so not many bazookas end up shooting at the team weapon. This inclination of the PTRS to shoot at team weapons can lead to some strange and often annoying interactions. Here the PTRS unit gets into range of the Raketen first, but once it gets into range of the flak half-track, it does not switch over its focus fire to shoot at that instead, which is probably what you as the player intend for it to do. However, coming from the other direction where it starts shooting at the flak half-track first, now it will stay locked on to the flak half-track and won't switch over to start shooting at the Raketen. So as the OKW player, having a Raketen near your flak half-track can be a pretty effective countermeasure against these type of tactics, especially when you consider that the flak half-track can smoke, thus switching the focus fire across to the Raketen. This PTRS behavior seems to apply to regular squads as well, indicating that units with anti-tank weapons inside troop transports do not look at the armor value of team weapons when deciding what to shoot at. And if we bring in a vehicle with more armor such as the Puma, once the PTRSs get in range of the Puma, they switch over to shoot at that, so the PTRSs will continue to shoot at their current target when it comes to lower armor vehicles such as the flak half-track and below with armor values of 11, but for the Puma with an armor value of 25, it is a high enough priority to get the PTRS units to switch targets. For the bazooka, in spite of it having more penetration than the PTRS, it does switch over to shoot at the flak half-track. However, for the slightly lower armored 222, there is no switchover, so it seems like 9 armor is the threshold here. And finally for the Panzerschreck, the squad inside did not switch over to shoot at the AEC that has an armor value of 55, but did switch over to shoot at the T70 that has an armor value of 70, so this appears to be the threshold for that weapon. That got a bit messy and complicated, so as a summary, for these anti-tank wielding units, the ideal target is whatever gives them closest to 100% chance to penetrate, but if the armor value of the vehicle is too low, this won't generate enough priority to overcome the other factors, so they might continue shooting at their current target instead. Next down the list is rotation. A penalty can be applied to the priority value if the squad has to rotate to face the enemy. In the case of the PTRS, this value is 0, so it doesn't matter if the target is directly in front of them or 180 degrees behind them. The lack of rotation penalty is also the case for the other infantry-based anti-tank weapons, such as the bazooka or the Shrek. However, for most small arms, this value is negative 0.035, so if the enemy is directly behind, in this case the penal SVT model, that would apply a priority penalty of negative 6.3. So overall not a huge factor in deciding what to shoot at. However, flamethrowers have a rotation value of negative 0.5, so if the unit was directly behind them, that would be minus 90, a massive factor in deciding what to shoot at. So for anti-tank weapons, rotation doesn't matter at all. For small arms, it is a small factor, but for flamethrowers, it is the key factor when deciding what to shoot at. Next down the list is suggested target. So say you gave a manual order to your squad to target a specific enemy, and then you give your squad another command, such as a movement command. Say you want to close the distance on the enemy while you're shooting at them. This suggested target value is what causes your squad to stay locked on to the enemy that you manually targeted. With a value of 1000, it far overrides everything else we've seen in this priority table. However, since we can't give manual targeting orders to the unit inside the troop transport, the suggested target value is a non-factor. Now you might be wondering what happens if I give an order to a squad to target a specific unit and then load them inside a troop transport. Will they continue shooting at the suggested target? Unfortunately, the answer is no. Jumping inside the troop transport appears to remove the suggested target. You could use this to your advantage. If your squad inside the troop transport is locked onto the wrong unit, you could jump out of the troop transport, then jump back inside to reset the priority calculation, removing factors like current target. Though, given the time it takes to jump out, then jump back inside a troop transport, especially if you had 2 squads, this is probably of fringe use. Next down the list is threat. This value of 10 is multiplied by the chance of the target's primary weapon penetrating me. In this case, this will be the PTRS penal model. And that has an armor value of 1, thus the threat should always be maxed out at 10. However, some questions do still remain about the threat value. The PTRS penal is inside a troop transport, so does the armor value of the troop transport come into play for this threat calculation? To test this, I put a PTRS penal inside an M5 that has a frontal armor value of 28. The enemy targets are going to be the M3 and the flak half-track that both have a frontal armor value of 11 to keep things even. However, at this range, the M3 has a penetration value of around 3, whereas the flak half-track has around 30. With a roughly 10% chance to penetrate, the M3 should have a threat value of 1, whereas the flak half-track will have a threat value of 10. So, if the armor value of the troop transport impacts the threat value, we would expect the PTRS penal to shoot at the flak half-track. But the PTRS penal shoots at the M3, and even if I move closer to the flak half-track, they still end up shooting at the M3. So the armor value of the troop transport does not seem to impact the threat calculation of the squad inside it. We have seen penetration chances of over 100% become relevant in some of the earlier calculations, so is that greater than 100% chance to penetrate multiplied by the threat value to take the priority number above 10. To test this, on the left we have the Sherman and on the right we have the Firefly, both with an armor value of 160. However, the Sherman is using HE rounds which give it a penetration of 25. And at this range the Firefly would have around 250 penetration. So with 10 times the threat value, we would expect the PTRS penal to always shoot at the Firefly. However, they actually just end up shooting at whichever tank is closest. So penetration chances above 100% are irrelevant. It also appears that a squad retreating does not change its threat level in any way. So you will continue to shoot at the retreating squad, all else remaining equal, thanks to the current target bonus. And finally, we have window bonus. This is an additional priority bonus given to certain types of weapon to ensure that that weapon is the one firing from the window of a building or from inside the troop transport, since the highest priority weapon takes the firing position. This is 0 for the PTRS and for every other weapon I encountered except for light machine guns, which have a window bonus of 1. If you compare the LMG on the left to the rifle on the right, you can see why this window bonus is necessary, because apart from the window bonus, their priority values are identical. And when you consider that LMGs tend to have a little bit of penetration, and this would trigger the over penetration priority penalty, the LMG would actually have lower priority than the rifle against infantry, so it would be last to take up a firing position. So this window bonus gets around that, ensuring the LMG is the one firing at infantry. As a side note, the Fallschirmjäger FG42 gets the window bonus, but the Obersoldaten Infrared STG does not. So now you know everything about troop transports and why the units inside of them shoot at what they do. I hope this encourages you to use them more in your own games. As always, a huge thank you goes out to my Patreon backers, and if you want me to continue making guides like this, I hope you consider coming on board.